we'll probably have some more participants trickling in. Welcome to Responding to the Attacks on Critical Race Theory. My name is Eric Maroney. I'm going to be moderating the panel tonight. This is an event that is hosted by the Tempest Collective. The Tempest Collective aims to create a space for the left to come together, to discuss and debate. Our goal is to put forward a revolutionary vision that is clear and understandable, that weighs in on strategic questions, offers concrete guidance, political theory, and presents a consistent working class politics from below. You can read more about Tempest at tempestmag.org. We'll drop the link in the chat in a few moments here. Tonight's event is an interactive event that is also being streamed live on Facebook. If you're watching on the live stream, we encourage you to click the link and join us for the interactive portion of the meeting. You'll be able to view the panelists' remarks through the live stream, but if you would like to participate in the discussion, we ask you to join the meeting through the link that is posted at the live stream. Tonight's lineup is an amazing group of panelists who are going to lead us through a discussion on the attacks on critical race theory, where those attacks fit into a broader backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement, and how we organize to stop it. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Bell Hooks, an intellectual powerhouse and a veteran of the Black, queer, and women's struggles. So no doubt her work is among that which the right is opposing and attempting to silence. And so I think it's very relevant that we're having this meeting tonight. Our panelists, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're beginning with Jesse Hagopian, who is an ethnic studies teacher at Garfield High School in Seattle. He's a member of the Black Lives Matter at School National Steering Committee and co-editor of Black Lives Matter at School from Haymarket. After hearing from Jesse, we're going to hear from Denisha Jones, the director of the Art of Teaching at Sarah Lawrence College, co-director of Defending the Early Years, assistant executive director for the Badass Teachers Association, and co-editor of Black Lives Matter at School with Jesse. And then we will round up our panel hearing from Naomi Murakawa, associate professor in African American Studies at Princeton University. She is the series editor for the Abolition Papers from Haymarket Books, and also the author of The First Civil Right, How Liberals Built Prison America. Naomi is also a member of the Tempest Collective. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jesse to kick us off.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. I'm excited to be with you all today for this important discussion. And it also just feels of monumental importance to be able to gather with community at a time when we're grieving the loss of Bell Hooks. It just feels better not to be alone when we're thinking about somebody who influenced everybody who was interested in liberatory pedagogy and intersectional movements for justice. So thanks for offering me this opportunity to be with community to talk about the fact that in some 14 states now across the country, uncritical race theorists have passed laws attempting to outlaw teaching the truth to children. And this is all over the country, north and south. We're talking about Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, Utah, North Dakota, and more. And to date, some 28 states have introduced legislation that attempts to require teachers to lie to students about structural racism, sexism, heterosexism, and other forms of oppression. We've seen the 1619 Project come under attack, the Zen Education Project, and Black Lives Matter at School have all become some of the primary targets of this right-wing attack. And of course, this isn't the first attack on Black education. This has been a permanent feature of American society from the time when it was outlawed for my ancestors and for enslaved Black people to be literate, right? Punishable by maiming and death, to Reconstruction, when over 600 Black schools were burnt down between 1866 and 1876. And, you know, they burnt down freedom schools during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. And today they are trying to reduce anti-racist pedagogy to ashes. And the irony is that in their zeal to ban the teaching of structural racism, they have effectively banned the teaching of all that they idolize. They would like us to abandon texts from Black luminaries like Bell Hooks or Toni Morrison and stick to teaching about the founding documents. But the founders that wrote into the Constitution that Black people were 3/5 of a human being. So we can't really even teach the Constitution if we follow their laws, right? And in the boundless satire that is the United States of America, Juneteenth became a federal holiday at the same moment when it became illegal to teach about it in many places. And we just see that the refrain of land of the free continues to take on new and intricate shades of mockery. The great paradox of these anti-critical race theory laws is that they are confirming the central claims of critical race theory, that racism is embedded in the law, even when it appears to use race neutral language, and that any progress towards racial justice will be met with white supremacist backlash, right? And that's really what we're seeing. The uncritical race theorists are certainly organizing this backlash. The uprising of 2020 produced the broadest protest in US history, led by Black people in every state, but joined by millions of other people of color and white people, right? And this is why we're facing this vicious attack. You know, Matthew Hahn, who I just spoke to a couple days ago, is a teacher in Tennessee, and he was fired from his job for assigning a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay and a poem by Kayla Janae Lacey about white privilege. Amy Dorofono was fired from a school in Florida for having a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom, and she taught at Robert E. Lee High School. Why do you think she had to have a flag that affirmed the lives of her Black children, right? Teachers around the country are receiving physical threats for teaching the truth. There was a teacher just a few hours south of Seattle where I live and teach, who received physical threats for signing the pledge that I helped launch with the Zen Education Project to teach the truth. And the threats have gotten so bad that even the Attorney General had to issue a statement saying that they will be investigating attacks on educators. And it's not just the educators who are being overtly attacked that's the problem. It's all the educators that took the Alice Walker book out of their curriculum, put it back on the shelf because they were worried about the kind of anti-racist conversations that could occur and the consequences that could have from them. But you have to have a way to explain inequality. For the majority of American history, the popular explanation for inequalities was biological inferiority, right? This overt scientific racism was mainstream American thought of the eugenics movement, right? And the new anti-CRT bill in South Carolina, if it passes, it would ban teaching, quote, that race and sex are social constructs. This would literally bring us back to a eugenicist's explanation of the biological understandings of race and making that respectable again. But critical race theory has a different explanation about race. It says that it's structural, that it is a social construct, but it is a structural feature of American society. And, they are quickly moving to ban books across the country. In South Carolina, they have removed The Handmaid's Tale. They've removed The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Fences, a play by August Wilson, was removed from the shelf. In New Hampshire, there's a new bill. They've already banned the teaching of structural racism in New Hampshire, but they want to make sure they were clear. So they're passing another law that is a loyalty oath law in New Hampshire that would ban public school teachers from promoting any theory that depicts U.S. history or its founding in a negative light, including the idea that the country was founded on racism. And the bill is updating a Cold War era law that bans educators from advocating for communism in schools and adds additional bans on advocating for socialism and Marxism. And it's really incredible how the Republicans right now are howling about Marxist plots behind critical race theory. The Idaho representative Ron Nate explained his sponsorship of the bill that passed there by saying, quote, House Bill 377 is a great win for Idaho because it prohibits the promotion of social justice programming and advocacy for critical race theory in our schools and universities. CRT is rooted in Marxist thought, is a pernicious way of viewing the world. It demands that everything in society be viewed through the lens of racism, sexism, and power, right? So to understand, I think, the attack on critical race theory today, we really have to understand the second Red Scare, at least, and what's called McCarthyism in this country. So I want to just take a minute to understand what the impact of McCarthyism was on teachers and education, because in the late 1940s and early 50s, the U.S. experienced a virulent anti-communist witch hunt. It wasn't started by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, but he certainly helped bring it to a boil. And thousands of people around the nation were condemned before they could even answer the question, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, right? And we have to understand that this attack really started before McCarthy with the Democratic Party President Harry Truman, who signed an executive order, order number 9835, that established a loyalty oath program for federal employees. And in the following years, some 5 million investigations of public employees were conducted. Thousands of people were fired and imprisoned. And really no one was safe, from government jobs to Hollywood to unions to the classrooms and schools. There was a suffocating chokehold of suspicion used to strangle any vocalization of dissent from an unquestioning allegiance to the Stars and Stripes. And sometimes these attacks were actually against people who identified as communists, who were leading some of the most dynamic anti-racist and labor struggles in the country. And often the label was applied to people who had any criticism of the government or any organized dissent. And children were made to take their pink eraser to critical thinking and just dutifully recite pledges and vows that they would not deviate from the orthodoxy of American exceptionalism. And across the country, many hundreds of educators were dismissed from schools under suspicion of being a communist. In New York City alone, there were 409 teachers who were purged from the school system after being labeled communist. The entire teaching corps of Los Angeles, some 30,000 educators, were forced to submit to loyalty investigations. In 1950, the state legislature around the country passed over 300 laws dealing with subversive practices, including many that directly impacted teachers. This was 28 states mandating loyalty oaths from teachers, 38 states that passed general sedition laws. Alabama passed Legislative Act 888, which required all publishers of instructional material to pledge not only that their materials, but also anything cited by them were not the works of known advocates of communism or Marxism or socialism. And this era was really summarized by what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where books were set aflame, reducing to ashes their supposed subversive portrayals of sex and socialism. And it got to an absurd level where in the Indiana State Textbook Commission declared that the adventures of Robin Hood should be banned from schools because they believed that it was part of a communist directive in education to advocate for robbing the rich to give to the poor. And, you know, they said these attacks were about containing the Soviet Union, but in reality, the Red Scare was primarily about two things. One, disrupting the militancy of the labor movement that was often led by communists and socialists, and also disrupting the Black freedom struggle. And I think similarly today, the red baiting of critical race theory is really about maintaining white supremacy and capitalist power. I want you to consider the words of Christopher Bedford, who's a senior editor at The Federalist, and he really made clear the underlying objectives of this attack on critical race theory. He said this, quote, "Our schools from preschool all the way to graduate programs have gone seriously astray in a way that no single law can ever hope to fix. Critical race theory, or whatever you want to call it, is a visible sore on our schools. They are painful symptoms of a much deeper sickness. Every year, this country spends $640 billion on public K-12 education, and a huge share of that money is going to people with evil ideas who want to poison your children to think the same way. So what's the solution? The answer is to think bigger. Here's what we should do. Defund the schools for real, right? That's what is behind this attack on critical race theory, right? They want to defund education to continue to fill the pockets of the wealthiest people the world has ever known. And because the GOP has made the attack on teaching about structural racism the centerpiece of their attempts to regain power in the 2022 and 2024 elections, this is really shaping up to be a generational battle akin to the struggle to desegregate the schools that shaped an entire era. But this struggle is about a lot more than just the elections. One of the primary ways that the billionaire class maintains its power has always been through controlling what is acceptable knowledge and what Henry Giroux has called the violence of organized forgetting. The current attacks on critical race theory, on ethnic studies, on critical pedagogy is not just antics or a distraction from the real issues as I hear liberals frame the issue, but I think instead should be understood as attempted epistemicide, right? The killing or silencing, annihilation of entire systems of knowledge. This is why we are building the Teach Truth movement. We have to engage in what Dr. Jarvis Gibbons calls fugitive pedagogy, right? The Zen Education Project teamed up with Black Lives Matter at School and the African American Policy Forum to lead a series of rallies over the summer. And then again on October 14th, on George Floyd's birthday, calling for educators across the country to teach lessons about structural racism. And I think today's struggle against these bills banning the teaching of structural racism is a struggle not just about education, but really about the entirety of what kind of society we are going to live in. It's about whether a multiracial democracy is still even a goal. It's a struggle over whether we're going to return to the hysteria and paranoia and destructiveness of the McCarthy era. And it's a struggle over whether the past really will be continued to be remembered at all, or if we will finally just throw it down the memory hole in service of maintaining white supremacy and the concentration of power in the hands of a tiny billionaire class. So I'll just end with the words of Bell Hooks, who said, "My hope emerges from those places of struggle where I witness individuals positively transforming their lives and the world around them. Educating is a vocation rooted in hopefulness. As teachers, we believe that learning is possible, that nothing can keep an open mind from seeking after knowledge and finding a way to know. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jesse. Chilling details that you shared with us. Next, we're going to hear from Denisha Jones. So if you want to just jump in, take over from here, keep the conversation.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for setting the stage for that, Jesse. It's so important. A lot of this is, affecting K through 12, but it's also impacting higher ed in these states that have passed these laws, right? State institutions. I'm fortunate that I'm at a private institution, but, and I'm in New York, which is not seeing these bills enacted, right? But that doesn't mean that it won't come and be filtered down at the college level, right? So the state institutions in these states that have passed these laws, like Florida and Idaho and Iowa, there are professors there who engage in critical race theory research that's now being threatened by these laws. So first is an example from a colleague of mine in Florida, at the University of Florida. So and it was interesting, as Jesse gave us the context, right? A lot of institutions put out statements after the murder of George Floyd where they felt they were going to do something in their addresses. There was a big push on college campuses by college students. They wanted more, right? They wanted to see this addressed. And the same thing was happening at University of Florida. And the students had met with the faculty. They wanted, they aired their concerns about, how they wanted the college to respond. So my colleague there, his department, they created a doctoral concentration. Now, mind you, this is a graduate doctoral program, and it's not the entire program. It's a concentration that you can choose, titled Critical Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Culture in Education. They thought that would help for students who want to specialize in this focus in their doctoral work. And now the colleges come back to say that they need to drop the words critical and race if they want to move forward with that concentration or not do the concentration, because of the pressure that the University of Florida is under from the state government as a state institution. And it's very troubling for Chris is a young Black man who recently took this job and now has to consider, can he continue working there in this environment? And it's interesting because a student who went to his job talk, said, you made it very clear that your work is critical race theory, right? That's what you do in social studies education. And now it's now you don't feel safe in that environment, right? Because you're being told that this concentration can't go forward. And this is very challenging. This is I think where the ACLU and other organizations are going to have to step in, because not that I believe it's okay to ban things at the K through 12, right? But the state has a vested interest in what children learn at K through 12. And since state education is a monopoly, right? They have to really think about that. But how can the state law prevent an adult from paying to go to college and not learning something that they choose to learn, right? How is that not a violation of that student's rights to be in college and have an option to take that class, right? We can understand if the college was forcing every student to take Introduction to Critical Race Theory in their freshman year. That's not happening, right? It's optional in different programs. And now that's coming under attack for a lot of people. And so I think we're going to have to continue to look at that and see how is that impacting faculty. The other thing that I think is interesting, and the idea of academic freedom, is that a lot of colleges are caught up in this diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Everyone's doing DIE work, DEI work, all of these things. But now they have to divorce it from critical race theory or not do it at all. And so what does that give you? That gives you continued whitewashed professional development that pretty much blames Black people for their existence, right? It allows you to keep talking about racist ideas like achievement gaps and bootstraps and those sorts of things without that context, right? One of the quotes being shared around by Bell Hooks is how she was driven to theory, right? Theory, she needed theory to understand, to make sense. And critical race theory has been that for a lot of us in these professions who struggle to understand all of this data that's being thrown at us, and not from a deficit lens that blames Black children, right? And so now you're going to have people in these institutions that can't talk about this theory that helps to explain this, right? But are forced to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that actually do more harm, right? If you don't have something like critical race theory to understand how whiteness operates in your space, right? then you're going to fall back on those old tropes that we know continue to harm students, right? And then I think about the students at my college at Sarah Lawrence and other schools. They're very much hungry for this knowledge, right? I do one class where we might read one, chapter on Freire and pedagogy of the oppressed, and they want a whole course now, and I'm not the one to teach it, right? I need to take it before I can teach it, right? But they're hungry. They want more of this, right? We do introduce them to bell hooks, but they want more. And now we're at a time where people aren't stepping forward to teach that because they're afraid that they can't in certain environments, right? So we're really limiting what's possible for these students who are hungry for this, who almost asked for it. A lot of these schools that were being challenged, right, for whether it put up a Black Lives Matter flag, that comes from students. Students are the ones demanding that the schools do this, to change their policies and to bring forth these issues. And now the schools are being told they can't do these things, right, because of this. So there's a big disconnect between what many young people are asking for, which is this knowledge earlier and earlier, not having to wait till they get to grad school. Why should a theory on race be limited just to lawyers and doctoral students, right? Why can't undergrads really understand and process this? And so it's really scary to think about what might happen to some of these students. The other thing I think is just really important, I've been reading about bell hooks and how she really put forth this idea of parenting for liberation, right? And this idea about loving children and how we do with that. And it also made me think of a colleague of mine recently shared a talk he shared some photos from a talk he gave about homeschooling. And so this is an advertisement it's called the School of the West. And this is what they literally say, right? The School of the West is an educational resource for homeschooling parents and the betterment of Western kind. Our mission, provide quality homeschooling material that addresses educational and psychological needs, enable our children to develop self-esteem by providing them the truth of their heritage, and create a worldwide community for our parents and their children. And so what is that heritage? Oh, that's on the next one. It's called white well-being. The School of the West exists to serve the children of Western kind. Western kind refers to white people as a collective and as a historical entity. White well-being is the welfare of Western kind in all its expressions. Here you will find only love and admiration for our people. You will find not only traditional educational material, but material designed to protect our children against the anti-white propaganda they will encounter in their lives. Now, this is a private organization doing this for homeschooling parents, but can we put it in the context of what's happening here, right? The places where Black and brown children go to get the knowledge that they need is being attacked, right? K through 12, you're not gonna learn that now. Go to state college, you're not gonna get it there either now in certain states. But mind you, white children and their families have access to something called white well-being and a curriculum designed to kind of reinforce these narratives and this racial identity development that leads to white supremacy, right? This is the type of identity development they're getting. And we have to look at the context of that and how that sets up certain children to be unprepared, right? The worst thing about, one of the worst things about education for Black children, I think Frederick Douglass talked about this, and Carter G. Woodson, right? How it often leaves you unprepared to serve your people, right? The traditional education system, because it leaves you accepting, right, and internalizing Black inferiority. And so all these Black people are graduating into these systems that didn't prepare them to work for their people. And now we're gonna see this as a reiteration of that, right? As they're no longer able to learn these things and to engage these things. The other issue, when we looked at the laws in my Foundations of Education class, we looked at some of the state laws, and I looked at Ohio in particular. And it was more on the K through 12 side, but one of the things they talked about, I also teach about social studies, right? And so they talked about how students are not allowed to engage in any type of activity with an organization. Like they're really trying to get rid of service learning for social justice, right? That a lot of places were doing. And if they are found to participate in any type of 4-credit program with one of those organizations, they're gonna lose the credit. So at the same time as we're closing off their minds, we're not teaching them the truth, we're actually not even allowing them to engage as active citizens in civic life, which is something we want students to be doing in high school. And so I think about how that's not love, right, as Bell Hook talked about, but that is a form of abuse and neglect to intentionally deny children the ability to engage this way, to learn these things, to engage in their civic capacities, right? under some belief that it's better for them, right? It's actually a form of abuse and neglect, and we need to see it that way, because that is the only way we're going to be able to legally call it out, right? That this is neglectful to children's, to their well-being, to their development. This is abuse, right? Spiritual abuse to their mind. Bettina Love talks about spirit murdering, right? And this is creating that system, right? And then a lot of this is connected to the reform efforts to really get rid of public education, right? If you think about Florida, for an example, what they're doing, they refuse to allow the schools to introduce mask mandates. And when parents said they'll leave, fine, take your kid to a charter school, right? It was all done in a way to kind of hurt the public school system. And this is going to do the same thing as well too, right? How many times can you say, well, if you're not happy with the state's public school system, send your kids to charter school, until there are no more public schools in Florida, which is what they would like, right? So to be more like New Orleans, it was a new, with an all charter system, right? And then thinking about the decrease in funding that states want to give to higher education, right? As we see these programs and more programs get cut and shifted, and no one wants to talk about these things, and the degrees that people are getting are not worth anything because they don't have the actual critical skills that they need, that employers are looking for when they come out, and they can't make sense and they can't contribute to their community because they don't know how, we'll see a decline in state education. And that'll just lead to people saying, well, we don't need to fund it anyway. And there'll be more proliferation of, for-profit online options. And so it just has this longstanding effect where it starts in K-12, right? It's attacking the teachers, like Jesse said, these loyalty oaths, and then it's filtering into the academia's world as well, limiting professors' academic freedom, and then listening to the choice, like limiting the choices that students have to actually learn these things. Most of us realize we learned these things when we went to college, and now there'll be a whole generation of kids who don't even learn and engage in these topics and have these conversations in college because they live in certain states that have banned this as well too. So I think it's just really important to contextualize, and then on the same side, what they're doing to reinforce a different narrative for different children, right? And how do you combat that? How do you have a conversation about white well-being, which isn't this, right? If you can't structurally talk about critical race theory and how it frames whiteness, right? Or critical whiteness studies and all the things that have come out of critical race theory as well too. So I know I have some more time, but I will stop there and let we go to Naomi, and then we can open it up for more discussion.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Naomi Murakawa. Please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Denisha and Jesse, and thank you to Tempest for hosting this conversation. I wanted to say that I feel like I was confused about critical race theory, the bans on critical race theory, largely because I was paying attention to many liberal media sources, and there tends to be a particular formula for speakers addressing the CRT bans, and it goes something like this. CRT is actually this, and then there's a definite Derek Bell, maybe Kimberly Crenshaw, racism is hegemonic, maybe something about interest convergence, and then a pivot to, that's not happening in schools. CRT is rarely taught outside of law school and perhaps some colleges and universities, which is a way of turning away from the resistance that's the counter-revolution that's actually confronting us. It's a way of practicing a form of, I think, snobbery by way of trying to define the problem away. And I got a little bit deeper into what the text of the laws are actually saying. And this is where I started to feel much more concerned about the power of the counter-revolutionary forces that's happening in the CRT bans. I think these could be potentially devastatingly strong attacks against BLM, against teachers and teachers' unions, and therefore against the entire labor movement, because K-12 teachers are so fundamental to labor power. And the third side of attack is just full-on high schools. And we have to acknowledge that high school students as a demographic, as people who come together 5 days a week, are enormously powerful as social organizers. So I just want to tell you a little bit, because in some ways I find it a tad distracting to think about CRT, what's CRT. I actually want to focus on what are the CRT bands? Just to bring some clarity on what they actually do. Okay, so the North Carolina one actually defines CRT and makes it illegal as a representation of any theory that racism is not merely the product of learned individual bias or prejudice, but insists that racism is systematically embedded in American society and the American legal system to facilitate racial inequality. The laws that have been passed in Tennessee and that are on the precipice of going through in Mississippi are even more capacious, by which I mean they are more vague. These are laws that make it illegal and justify the withdrawal of funding from schools where any part of the course of instruction, and this is important, or any teachers or other employees of the school use supplemental educational materials that include or promote any of the following concepts. Some of the concepts that are listing include teaching the concept that meritocracy is inherently racist or sexist or designed by a particular race or sex to oppress members of another race or sex. It's also illegal to teach that this state or the United States is fundamentally or irredeemably racist or sexist. And it's also illegal to teach that promoting division between or resentment of a race, sex, religion, creed, nonviolent political affiliation, social class, or class of people. Now, and this is sort of the boilerplate legislation that's going around. I wanted to tell you a little bit about one of the first complaints that's come across. We know from Jesse that Matthew Hahn was just fired in Tennessee for teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates to his social studies class. Here's the sort of claims that are being brought against textbooks that to me sound quite benign, and I would probably say are not actually doing CRT, but here are some of the complaints, wrongly are not doing CRT, but here's some of the complaints coming forward. This is coming from Tennessee, a group called the Moms for Liberty. But just want to let you know, if you read a headline that says this claim was dismissed, that's kind of inaccurate. The claim was issued so quickly that the statute of the law has not taken effect yet. So it's not, these claims have not been substantively dismissed. It's just the state of Tennessee Department of Education saying, we're not ready for these claims yet. You jumped the gun. Here are the kinds of complaints that they're bringing forward is illegal for a second grade curriculum. The list of the grievances on pages 23, you show photographs of white firemen blasting Black children to the point of, quote, bruising their bodies and ripping off their clothes, close quote. There's another grievance, which is the textbook shows the Norman Rockwell painting called The Problem We All Live With, which depicts Ruby Bridges walking to school with the N-word in the background. Another grievance, the accompanying teacher's manual for instructing teachers to emphasize the following. Emphasize that nonviolence wasn't an easy idea, especially for Southern Blacks. And then the quoted material from the teacher's manual, they met hate every day, including from the all-white police force. They expected unfair arrests, beatings, or worse from police. These are the kinds of claims that are being brought forward as wrong under the text of the law. The way the organization summarizes these particular violations is that they hit the following punchlines: that white people are bad, that people of color are mistreated, in parens, by white people. Also, that America is unjust. And the fourth and final offense, that police officers, parens, and firemen target people of color. All of these are presented as violations of the Tennessee statute as put forward. And quite frankly, the Tennessee statute is written in such a capacious and broad fashion that I'm not convinced that this group is wrong, which is a way of saying, if this law holds, I think that this is the kind of curriculum that could potentially be thrown under the bus, which is another way of saying it is actually the Norman Rockwell version of the civil rights movement that is on the precipice of being thought of as unspeakable, right? As just beyond the pale. This is clearly a targeting of BLM and beyond. I know there's controversy over what BLM has achieved so far. I think we can say unequivocally that BLM has achieved the quite monumental fate of pushing open a national conversation on white supremacy. It's really powerful that that is the dominant achievement, and it is the one that is actually being put forward in a gag order that is being put forward across so many states. The second set of attacks, I think, are very clearly ways of punishing teachers. So I think the CRT bans are targeted at teachers in very particular ways. For teachers' most egregious offenses of doing the following things over the last decade. Certainly the offenses of striking in Chicago victoriously in 2012 and 2019, the offenses of the amazing and impressive Wildcat strikes through 2018 in West Virginia, Arizona, Colorado, Oklahoma, which had a 9-day state walkout. I will say all of these strikes had as one of many demands that teachers should get raises. Something, of course, no one here should raise an eyebrow at, but I want to insist that what was so amazing about these strikes is that we saw teachers as a militant minority performing and working the politics of solidarity, in which they were demanding a variety of social justice demands and improvement in the quality of life and the conditions for their students. Some other egregious teacher offenses: fighting for safe conditions for working and learning in the midst of COVID, with unions being on the front line of protecting workers. And also another offense, joining BLM in key moves, in particular moves to remove cops from schools. I will say that these connections between teachers' unions and BLM has not been lost on the repressive conservative forces that have been putting together the anti-CRT bans. Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute, a senior fellow there and a very proud self-proclaimed architect of the anti-CRT bans, has taken unions to task. In a Washington Post headline, he wrote, quote, "Embracing critical theory, teachers unions say they, not parents, control what kids learn," close quote. This is coming in the aftermath of the National Education Association saying that they would join Black Lives Matter at school and the Zen Education Project to have a national day of action on George Floyd's birthday. And because of that egregious act, and an egregious act as a union, they were called out by Rufo and similar conservatives as, quote, "the left-wing ideologues masquerading as educators." The punishment for teachers takes a number of forms in the CRT bans. The most obvious one is the threat of being fired. And this is nothing trivial. And you don't have to fire hundreds of people to have a massive chilling effect on what people feel that they can teach at school. But I also think there's a broader mechanism at work in the CRT bans, which is that I think these bans are another way of trying to structure the work of teaching so that it's such that it's simply about executing a set of predetermined, pre-approved tasks that anyone, including a 22-year-old volunteer from Teach for America, can do with no training. This is a way of de-skilling the teaching profession. It reminds me of a vision of teaching that bell hooks put forward as the worst understanding of a rote assembly line approach to educating young people. This kind of attack is very much in line with things that we've seen in the last decade. All efforts, as Denisha and Jesse mentioned, ways to actually just try and kill public school education and take down unions and say that this work is not valid as a work, as a profession. The final attack, I think that this is a straight up attack on students and on high school activism in particular, which is in some ways wonderfully unpredictable in the kinds of uprisings that students come forward with everything from rising up against gun violence, BLM, the Sunrise Movement, and a generation of students for whom queer and trans liberation is a language that just comes to them with power and force in ways that we should all be learning from them.
Thank you. Our panelists have given us a lot to think about. Before we move into discussion, I just want to, again, to those of you who are watching on the live stream, we encourage you to join us in the Zoom as part of the discussion, as our live stream is going to shut off now. I think from the loyalty